We keep telling the same stories over and over again. Different faces, different places, and different eras. But the monsters never stay dead for long. This isn't a failure of imagination, it's the foundation of narrative art. Archetypal stories survive because every generation reshapes them. Repetition, reinvention, reinterpretation, and yes, remakes are what keep these tales alive. Yet no word inspires more dread amongst horror film fans than remake. Then, when it comes to reinvention, one of the key ways we do this is adaptation from the page onto the screen. Remaking itself is a kind of adaptation, and this word is not so dreadful to hear, but it does bring with it a similar fear. When it comes to remakes and adaptations, we too often seem motivated to judge them by one factor and one factor alone: faithfulness. A metric that sets these films up for failure right from the start. What makes a good remake or adaptation is far more complex than faithfulness. In fact, it is this very thing that too often bogs them down. But if the process of remaking and adapting stories is so important, why do audiences recoil at the thought? Are we collectively wrong, or have we simply learned to fear repetition as parasitic? Well, yes, and also yes. The truth is, the stigma around these processes is relatively new and motivated less by artistry and more by industry. The 2000s saw a massive boom of horror remakes once studios realized that this was a low-risk profit machine. Practically anything remotely recognizable got a remake, often one which was pretty poor. At the same time, the young adult booked a movie boom, and later the Disney DreamWorks live-action recycling factory taught an entire generation, and is continuing to teach us, that adaptation was synonymous with cash grab. For most audience members, these are the first images that spring to mind when you say remake or adaptation, which is no surprise. But these are far from the only or even the most notable examples. No, the most notable examples don't spring to mind because for the most part, they have managed to transcend the original text. Our favourite remakes and adaptations are far less associated with these labels because they stand so strongly on their own. Yet some of our most beloved horror classics are themselves remakes or adaptations. Jaws, Psycho, Rosemary's Baby, and The Exorcist are all iconic films, and are all literary adaptations that almost completely eclipse their novels. And these films succeeded not because they are faithful, but because they all understood that, as Marshall McLuhan put it, the medium is the message. A novel's psychological interiority, its pacing, its language, its silences, becomes something entirely different when translated into film. The meaning of the story changes because the form changes. Adaptation is not transcription, it's transformation. Mike Flanagan understands this better than most. His Haunting of Hill House series is less an adaptation of Shirley Jackson's novel than a thematic reimagining. The characters, plot structure, and even the central haunting differ dramatically. Yet Jackson's preoccupation with psychological terror, domestic instability, and the porous boundary between internal and external haunting remains intact. The book is still there if you want to experience that story. What Flanagan did was simply give you another option. Likewise, his Doctor Sleep faced an almost impossible challenge. Stephen King's novel served as a sequel to the original novel version of The Shining. But Stanley Kubrick's arguably more iconic film version of this story diverged sharply from King's text, and Flanagan wanted to please both fans of this film and Stephen King himself. And what he managed to do was ingeniously reconcile these conflicting canons, adapting Stephen King's novel while incorporating Kubrick's visuals and thematic universe. The resulting film is not a compromise, but a synthesis. His adaptation is not the reproduction of a single source, but it's a negotiation of two texts. Tell someone your favourite film is The Thing, and they don't need to ask if you mean the 1951 version. They know that you mean John Carpenter's 1982 masterpiece. They also probably don't even know that both films are based loosely on a novella from 1938. Carpenter's version transcended its source because it didn't imitate. It rebuilt the story around 1980s fears, AIDS-era paranoia, bodily invasion, and the distrust of institutions. And this is where the potential magic of adapting a pre-existing story lies, in conversing with the original and interpreting it for the modern age, not in copying it. Cronenberg's The Fly did the exact same thing, transforming a pulpy creature feature into a tragedy of disease, addiction, and bodily betrayal. But perhaps my favourite example of this, and a far more recent one, is Luca Guadagnino's 2018 remake of Suspiria. I think this is the perfect case study to use to explain why remakes that don't strive to be faithful work so well, because the original Suspiria is so iconic that it actually cannot be transcended, making the task even harder. I'll admit that back in 2018, I was fully prepared to hate this remake. Look, the original Suspiria is one of my all-time favourites, and without Argento's neon-lit shots or Goblin's haunting score, I couldn't really grasp the point in remaking the film, but I was too focused on the wrong things. You can't out-Argento, so Guadagnino didn't even try. Fresh off the success of Call Me By Your Name and not quite yet the sell to me that he is today, Guadagnino never tried to compete visually with Argento. No, instead, what he wanted to create was almost a companion piece to the original, but one that can also stand entirely alone. Guadagnino's Suspiria is political, historical, and grounded, reframing the story through the trauma of the Baader-Meinhof era and feminist revolt. He took what was bubbling below the surface of the original and created something completely new. The easier route, the one that would have lazily tried to please the fans of the original, would have been to replicate Argento's visual style, as this is what so many people love of the original. But a remake like this would have been a weak imitation. Instead, Guadagnino gave us a bold reinvention that wasn't scared to be different. Sure, fans of the original were polarized, but the end product is undeniably more interesting than a simple mimic. The remake could never truly surpass the original, an impossible task, but it does at least now call for us to clarify which version of Suspiria we are discussing, a demand not every remake can boast. If you say Friday the 13th or A Nightmare on Elm Street and then go on to talk about their remakes, most people are going to be pretty lost or at least very shocked. So evidently, remakes aren't inherently derivative. They can be bold, imaginative conversations with their source material. The real question shouldn't be, is it faithful? But it should instead be, what new fears does this version expose? Why this story now? A good remake doesn't imitate, it interprets. Linda Hutchian and Robert Stamm have been saying the same thing in academic terms for decades. Fidelity is a misguided metric because no adaptation can reproduce a story unchanged. Different audiences, historical context, and crucially, different mediums always reshape meaning. The question should not be, is it accurate? But what does this version express that the original could not? I'll only touch on it here as I've already made a full video on the new Wuthering Heights, but this is exactly the issue here. Fennell's desire to deviate from the text is not the problem. Instead, it's the lazy way that she did it. Her version of Wuthering Heights brought nothing new to the conversation. Instead, it inherited an almost decade-long tradition of cutting the second half of the novel and flattening the story's themes of race and inherited trauma. Yet there are so many more interesting ways to approach adaptation. Book-to-film adaptations seem to be where most people obsess over the idea of faithfulness to the source material. But just like with a film-to-film remake, this is a poor way to judge a book-to-screen adaptation. As I've already said, translation is transformation, no matter in what medium it is done. When it comes to adapting a classic novel, the original text is a little harder to transcend. But this is fine. Transcending shouldn't always be the goal. Just like with Suspiria, the goal of coexistence is just as, if not more important. If you're adapting Frankenstein and want to boot Mary Shelley out of the picture, I'd argue that you're definitely the wrong person for the job. But as our most recent Frankenstein adapter, Guillermo del Toro, put it, adapting a classic is like marrying a widow. You have to respect the late husband, but on Saturdays you are allowed to get it on. Frankenstein is a bit of a more complex example, as more people are familiar with Frankenstein as a symbol, one characterized by Universal's green-painted Boris Karloff, than Frankenstein as a complex literary classic. Del Toro's Frankenstein stays true to the book in ways that other Frankenstein adaptations haven't always. Yet it is also far from entirely faithful, but this is the beauty of adapting a true classic. Texts like Frankenstein or Dracula are modern myths, as recognizable as biblical figures. Just like Shakespeare's classics have been adapted into modern rom-coms or animated features about lions, so too should these horror classics diverge and adapt. There are so many stories that we can point to as loose Frankenstein adaptations. From Ex Machina to Frankenweenie to Poor Things to May, Frankenstein is an archetype in itself these days. This gives more direct attempts at adaptation, an even tougher but arguably more rewarding challenge. A modern Frankenstein doesn't just engage with the original novel, it participates in an ongoing cultural conversation with every version that has come since. Del Toro's adaptation demonstrates exactly how this dialogue between fidelity and reinvention can work. By relocating the story to the aftermath of the Crimean War, he situates Victor's experiment within a landscape of industrialized death. This shift doesn't overwrite Shelley's ideas so much as refract them through a new historical moment, highlighting the political dimensions of scientific ambition, the commodification of bodies, and humanity's drive to manipulate nature. The addition of Harlander, a ruthless war profiteer manipulating Victor, pushes these themes even further. The film also reshapes the Frankenstein family. Victor takes on a more pointedly Byronic psychology, while Elizabeth is granted a stronger, more autonomous voice that gently echoes Mary Shelley's own biography, in the ways that her authorship has often been overshadowed. Del Toro's most striking intervention is his rendering of the creature. While Shelley gives us an articulate, philosophical being, Del Toro emphasizes vulnerability, trauma, and an aching desire for affection. This shift doesn't contradict the novel. Instead, it distills its emotional core. The creature's suffering is revealed not as innate monstrosity, but as a direct consequence of Victor's abandonment. Visually, Del Toro turns to romanticism, especially the sublime sensibility of Caspar David Friedrich, to frame the creature not as a horror icon, but as a figure suspended between nature, science, and the divine. The result is an adaptation that works as an homage and a deeply personal expression, illuminating both Shelley's text and the mythic symbol Frankenstein has become, while reflecting Del Toro himself. The exact same method of adaptation can be applied to Dracula, another literary giant that has recently received a striking reinterpretation. Dracula functions much like Frankenstein, not as a single text, but as a living archetype, constantly rewritten to mirror whatever haunts us most. Robert Eggers' Nosferatu takes a path similar to Del Toro's, not by attempting a definitive retelling of Stoker's novel, but instead by engaging with the text's cultural afterlife. His decision to remake the 1922 silent film rather than to adapt Dracula directly is especially fruitful, because it raises a crucial question. What does it mean to adapt a story that is already an adaptation? What does it mean to adapt Nosferatu instead of Dracula? This distinction matters. Dracula is a Victorian novel rich with anxieties about sexuality, imperialism, technology, and modernity. Nosferatu, however, is already a transformation. A distillation of these anxieties into something more expressionistic, more symbolic, and more historically situated. Adapting Dracula means grappling with Stoker's text, its structure, and its moral frameworks. Adapting Nosferatu means grappling with a myth that has already slipped free from its source, shaped instead by cinematic language, censorship loopholes, and nearly a century of cultural interpretation. F.W. Murnau's unauthorized film recast Stoker's Count as a figure of plague, foreign invasion, and Weimar-era decay. Werner Herzog's 1979 Nosferatu the Vampire reimagined this same creature for a post-war Germany haunted by historical repetition, nihilism, and a longing for transcendence. Eggers adds yet another layer, foregrounding Ellen and shifting the story toward tragic romantic melodrama. This move toward desire, power, and self-destruction reflects contemporary anxieties just as earlier versions reflected their own. Adapting the same story at different points in history allows for new forms of historical reflection. But temporal distance is not the only factor that reshapes a narrative. Cultural context can transform a story just as dramatically, even when an adaptation occurs just a few years later. Placing the same narrative within a different culture can reveal new anxieties, aesthetics, and values that distinguish one retelling from another. The cultural adaptations for the sake of accessibility have also shaped the horror landscape. The 2000s Americanization of Japanese and Spanish horror is often dismissed as cultural flattening, but many of these remakes were not reductive. They were translations of fear. The Ring transforms Japanese anxieties about technological alienation into distinctly American post-9/11 dread, surveillance, and domestic instability. The Grudge reframes ideas of residual trauma through the lens of American dislocation and cultural occupation. Quarantine shifts Spain's critique of institutional secrecy into an American context, defined by panic, containment, and distrust. But what happens when these cultural or temporal adaptations make little to no changes at all? You might be expecting me to say that these never work, that striving for such faithfulness is absurd. But actually, in these instances, it's intent that matters most of all. So, to explain this, let's compare two shot-for-shot remakes, 1998's Psycho and 2007's Funny Games. While on the surface, these remakes might seem similar, they each represent a completely different philosophy, which is exactly why one works and the other doesn't. For Psycho, accuracy is an obsession. Imitation is mistaken for respect. Director Gus Van Sant attempted to replicate Hitchcock's 1960 classic almost frame for frame, but the film ultimately proves why this approach is often misguided. The film wanted to mimic Hitchcock's craftsmanship without understanding the psychology behind it. As well as replicating pretty much every shot, Van Sant did also add some new moments, like the infamous cutaway to a stormy sky during the murder scenes, or Norman Bates experiencing a strange sexualized reaction while spying on Marion. These additions were attempts to modernize the story or make its subtext explicit, but instead they break the carefully calibrated tone of the original. Hitchcock's Psycho works because so much of its horror is implied, hidden in shadows, editing ribbons, and Anthony Perkins' subtle performance. By inserting blunt, literalized images or behavioral details, the remake removes the ambiguity that made Norman terrifying. Instead of deepening the narrative, these embellishments flatten it. Even the elements copied exactly do not function in the same way. The pacing feels off, the color cinematography doesn't work, and the actors deliver lines written for a different era with no reinterpretation. The result is a film that looks like Psycho but never feels like it. It recreates the skeleton of the original without the soul. What Van Sant demonstrates is that a shot-for-shot remake cannot succeed if the filmmaker simply traces another artist's work, without rethinking how its techniques communicate emotion, suspense, or themes to a new audience. Now, Funny Games, by contrast, succeeds precisely because its director understands this. Michael Haneke remade his own film not to imitate but to amplify, using the same shots and structure to reach a new cultural audience with the same message. Literal replication can be meaningful when it's done with intent rather than out of fear of deviating from the original. Michael Haneke's remake of his own film, Funny Games, is an almost exact copy of his 1997 Austrian version. Same shots, same beats, nearly the exact same runtime, just translated from German into English. And this is actually what makes it so compelling. Haneke didn't remake Funny Games because he thought that the first film was flawed or outdated. He remade it because the audience that he wanted to confront, the American audience that he feels is most implicated in the violence that he wanted to critique, never saw the original. The replication was the message. The shot-for-shot structure wasn't laziness. It was a provocation, a way of saying, if you didn't listen the first time, I'm going to say it again, and this time I'll say it in your language. Haneke's remake proves that copying is not inherently creatively bankrupt. A remake can mirror its source precisely and still offer something new, if the purpose, the context, and the intended audience have changed. In other words, intent matters. A remake that repeats because it has something new to express is fundamentally different from a remake that repeats because it's afraid not to. In other words, the failure of Psycho and the success of Funny Games reveals a fundamental truth about remakes. Fidelity means nothing without intentionality. Copying shots cannot recreate meaning. Only a filmmaker who understands why those shots worked in the first place can bring them back to life, be that in a new way or not. Monsters survive exactly because they reflect the fears of the era, and stories survive because they change. And horror itself refuses not to change. Every remake and adaptation, whether radical reinterpretation, cultural translation, or meticulous replication, reveals what a particular moment is afraid to confront. To measure these works by faithfulness is to misunderstand their purpose. Adaptation is not preservation. It's a dialogue. It's a negotiation between mediums, histories, anxieties, and audiences. When done well, it expands the original text and ensures its relevance for another generation. Horror has always understood this better than most genres. The monster returns not to repeat the same story, but to tell us what has changed since the last time we saw it. And that, in the end, is the real power of reinvention. There are many ways to do it, and only one truly bad thing to avoid. Don't get bogged down in replication. Make changes or don't make changes. Just make sure that you're doing it with purpose. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know some of your favorite remakes and adaptations and why you think they work so well. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and check out some of my previous videos.